Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Lita Downs from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Quantitative Secondary Data Analysis, Concepts and Application. Today's presenter is Dr. Reginald Taylor. He is the Associate Director of Capstone Student Resource Support in the Center for Research Quality. Before I hand things over to Dr. Taylor, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items in Zoom. Today's main content will be delivered on your main screen. You do have audio settings, so if you need to toggle back and forth between your computer speakers and your telephone, you do have that option. You can also adjust audio as well by clicking on the audio settings button in the lower left-hand corner. There is a chat box. As you see, we have some chat going on right now. We have faculty and students on the line that are chatting, so please feel free to chat. Please also select all panelists and attendees. I know it gives you options. I wish we could just narrow it down to the one option, but if you can, make sure to select all panelists and attendees. That would be great. We have Dr. Liu, who will be monitoring questions while Dr. Reginald Taylor is presenting. We do have closed captioning, so if you need that function, please click on the closed captioning box as well. Next, we have our View Options button in the upper part of the screen. When clicking on that, you have the option to toggle back and forth from a full screen mode to a minimized screen mode. You can also zoom in on the screen as well if you need to see the content a little larger. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Reginald Taylor. It's great to have you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Lida, very much for the introduction. Again, I'm Dr. Taylor, and I'll be presenting the Quantitative Secondary Data Analysis webinar here today. And what we'll cover here in the overview is just a brief overview of what quantitative secondary data analysis is. I will make a few comments on the institutional review board requirements. And then I think where the focus of this presentation is going to be on perhaps avoiding the biggest mistake that we encounter and that we see when one is embarking on quantitative secondary data analysis. Now, once we identify that mistake, we're going to discuss a 4-step process that, if followed, it will avoid making this biggest mistake that will cost the student a lot of time and money and frustration in the process. And we will then apply this 4-step process. So at the end of this webinar, you will be able to see exactly what you need to do in addition to having an understanding what secondary data analysis is, but what you need to do to avoid making this biggest mistake. I'll then briefly provide some resources for you to use after we end this webinar, and then we'll go into the questions and answers. Okay, next please. Now, again, this is secondary data analysis, and we'll go ahead and get into the presentation. Now, what is secondary data analysis? As you all are aware, it is data collected by someone else for other purposes. And you, as the researcher, have found that perhaps you want to use that data that was collected by someone else and apply that to your particular research. Now, with quantitative secondary data analysis, there comes some advantages, of just a few of which I'll mention here. A substantial savings of time and money. The data is readily available. You don't have to go through the recruitment process and surveying process, etc. And you won't have to spend money such as the money spent on SurveyMonkey or some other service to host your data collection process. Also, there's a wide scope of available data, So more than likely, a researcher should be able to find a suitable data set. Also, one of the advantages should be and can be the quality of the data. A lot of large organizations that collect the data in the initial research process, these organizations, especially like a lot of government organizations, I've worked for the Army Research Laboratory, the Navy Medical Research Unit, and we had dedicated individuals that understood research design, data collection, etc. And so the quality of the data that we received was of high quality. Now, of course, with any data collection method, we have some disadvantages. And this is what we're going to focus on. The data set might not suit a particular research question. And that will leave an inevitable gap between the student's research, your interest, and the original purpose of the collected data. Next. Okay, here it is. Now, a brief few words on the IRB process. Again, this is not focused to to go into depth into the IRB, but the IRB perspective is that a student can examine a public data set at any time. And even more so, you can run the analysis without IRB approval if the committee approves. Now, I really don't see any reason why a committee would not approve the examination of the public data set. And I'll go into that a little deeper. As a matter of fact, that is the emphasis of this presentation. Now, there may also be some private data sets that are available out there, but you will have to get access to these private data sets according to the requirements of the owners or the custodians of that data set, of those records. IRB approval may be required. Again, this would be a very specific requirement based on each research scenario, so there's really no prescribed answer to that. But some of the things, two big questions according to the IRB that you want to ask yourself is, ask the owner, how is that data transferred? How does that data get from their place where they house that data? How does it get to you? And then also to, what are the storage requirements? This may be some very sensitive data or something. And so, how will you store that data to ensure confidentiality and things of that nature? Now, any questions specific to the IRB regarding the data set access, please just use that email down at the bottom and send the IRB an email, and they'll be more than happy to discuss a little bit more in depth with you about the access requirements for the private data sets. Now, this is the meat of the matter here, making that big mistake, and that is putting the cart before the horse. And as you can see here, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And as you can see, when you put that cart before the horse, you'll be destined to fail. And this is what we want to avoid in your research. And that mistake is formulating your research questions before you identify the data set. Now let's think about that. When we're collecting the data, primary data, the research questions are our ideas, and we're going to formulate these research questions and design this study so that we are then going to go out and collect the needed data. But suppose you formulate your research questions and you have not set eyes on the data set. Well, what happens is that more than likely, it's going to be a futile attempt to identify a data set containing all the needed variables or constructs that have been identified in your research question. Let's just think about that. I'll just give a real quick example. For example, suppose political affiliation is one of the variables identified in your research question, and you haven't seen the data set yet. And you get your hands on a data set that has some of the variables needed, but the political affiliation is not in the data set. As you can see, you now have a research question that you have written that is not suitable, and it doesn't align with the data set. More so, if that variable was a predictor variable or an independent variable, that variable then ideally is a part of your theory or your conceptual framework or proposition for understanding the dependent variable. Now, let's think about that. If we have to remove one of those variables from the research question, then we are now destroying the integrity of our theory. We may have to even go back and start rewriting the theory component, because the theory pretty much comprises your predictor or independent variables. So again, you cannot really formulate research questions before getting your hand on the data set. Now, one of the things that we see much too often when we do our doctoral research appointments and we work with students on the research alignment is that they come with research questions, theory, dependent variables, purpose statement, things appearing to be in alignment at face value. But then my question is, okay, where's the data set? And what happens is that I get the blank stare and the response is, I haven't found the data set yet. Well, that is the biggest mistake, because you have to now go out and hope that you can find that data set that contains every single variable that you have included in your research question, addressed in your theory, etc. So you can see now that you should never, ever, ever start formulating your research questions before identifying and getting your hands on the data set or the code book or whatever information you can, so that you know that your research question is aligning with the data set. That's a very, very critical mistake that's made. And so we want to make sure moving forward that you do not make that mistake. If you are contemplating quantitative secondary data analysis, and if you have written your theory, your research questions, and you have not seen that data set yet, I strongly encourage you to stop, hold everything, and identify a data set. Now, here's the slide that says that, again, picture's worth 1,000 words. You are a student, you propose secondary data research. The first thing, my advice would be stop, hold everything. Do not proceed. Let's follow this 4-step process to ensure that you have a doable study. Let's now take a look at this 4-step process. Now, of course, you have a problem, or in quantitative research, that equates to the dependent variable, that variable that you're trying to understand. And so what you do is you go in search of a secondary data set, a data set that contains that problem variable. Now, again, you'll have to ask that owner, how's that data transferred? What are data storage requirements? Again, if that is a public data set. Now, when you see that data set and it has your problem or dependent variable, we know that it is another piece of the equation, and that is the theory or the predictive variables. That theory or those predictive variables have to be derived from that data set. So as you can see, you really can't even write about your theory or identify a theory yet until you have seen this data set and are comfortable that every variable that you need, those predictive variables which comprise your theory, the dependent variable which comprises your problem variable, that everything is in a well-contained data set that aligns with your theory, your research questions, hypotheses, etc. And there's a link to a video tutorial titled The Role of Theory in Quantitative Research that you can review at your convenience that will give you a little bit more in-depth information pertaining to theory. So again, the theory sits on the predictor independent variable side. The dependent variable is that problem variable, but both sides of the equation, the theory side containing the predictive variables, the dependent variable, everything has to be in that data set. So you can see now the problem with an a priori research question, not knowing if you're going to find a data set that aligns with what you're trying to do. That's a very critical 4-step process that you want to follow. Now, let's go through this process, and this is where we get into the application of this webinar. So let's assume that a student is interested in researching job satisfaction. There is a problem or the dependent variable. This is the focus of their problem statement. You know, the negative impacts, the gap in the literature pertaining to job satisfaction. And of course, you go through peer-reviewed literature, recommendations for future research, et cetera, to help you identify this problem variable and other studies perhaps that have looked at that same problem. That's step one, identify your problem variable. Now you have in mind that your problem that you want to examine is job satisfaction. Now, let's assume that you go out and you start doing your research and you say, I have found a potential, and again, the word is potential, a potential secondary data set or code book. And we're going to use this example of a data set called the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And so you as a student, you've gotten your hands on this Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. Either you have the data, or you have the technical manual, or you have the code book that tells you all what is contained in this data set. That's the first, that's very critical to do. Get your hands on a data set. Now, you've got your hands on the data set and you're going to review that data set. Now, in this Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, you'll see that it tells you that this survey was used, of course, with federal employees, and it measures their perceptions of whether and to what extent, conditions, characteristics of successful organizations are present in their agencies. And you look at that data set and you see that they say that there's basically 5 different domains, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 domains, or 7 categories of data that they requested. So you would know now that they asked questions about a person's personal work experiences, that they ask about the work unit, they ask about agency, there was questions about supervisor, there was questions about leadership, and as you see in there, that dependent variable satisfaction is sitting in this data set or the code book, and you say, wow, okay, I have half of the puzzle solved. Now, in this example, you're going to look in this data set and you'll see that, okay, they collect data on work-life balance. And perhaps you say, wow, that's very interesting. And so I am going to ground my study in the work-life balance theory to see how work-life balance perhaps predicts or impacts job satisfaction. But notice that that question that you have put in your mind, you now have found a data set that appears to have that information contained in it. So also most data sets will have demographic information. So, perhaps gender or age or something may also be variables or constructs that you want to include in your research question. Now, let's take this a bit further. Now, let's assume now that we're looking in this data set and we are looking at the items, the actual questions that are being asked in this survey. And we know undoubtedly that this survey has collected data on job satisfaction. Now, we see this and we know that we can measure job satisfaction. We are now comfortable to proceed with job satisfaction as being that dependent variable. And as you can see here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 9 questions that measure job satisfaction. So you, again, are very confident that you have captured a data set with your problem variable. But then again, there's another piece. We must have that theory component. So as you can see, we can't write a blind theory. We have to see what's in the data set. And these are actually true items from the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. Now, as I examine the data set further, I look and see, wow, there is a component on work-life balance. And they have asked questions to those federal employees, such as how satisfied are you with the following work-life program? We know now that we have data that measures the work-life balance constructs. And specifically, this one is looking for telework. We also see, wow, there was another question or item in this survey that asked the respondents, how satisfied are you with work-life programs, but specifically alternate work schedules. We now can sit back and say, wow, I'm very confident now that I can write those key components of my perspectives or proposal because I have identified a data set that contains the job satisfaction variable, which is my problem, and also some variables that I can use as my theoretical orientation. But could you imagine writing a research question first and then going to try to find out of the millions probably of data sets out there to try to find a data set that matches exactly with what you have written in your questions, your theory? As you can see, you stand a good chance of having to go back to square one and re-engineer your study. Now, let's take this a step further. and we've identified this data set. Now, at this point, we can now start writing those very critical components. And in most cases, we write these components first, and then we go looking for the data set. And again, that's what I'm saying. Don't make that mistake. Follow the process, find the data set first, see what variables or constructs are included. Now write the questions. And as you can see, the purpose statement of this quantitative correlation study is to examine the relationship between, and we know that work-life balance is in this data set, which is our predictors, and job satisfaction, which is our dependent variable. And we can even go specifically to the predictive variables, our telework and alternate work schedule, because we have seen that these variables are in the data set. And we indicate how it's measured, and then the criterion variable is job satisfaction. We can then go on and write our question. What is the relationship between work-life balance and job satisfaction? And so on and so forth, and write the corresponding null and alternative hypotheses. Now, I'm going to reiterate again. Many times we'll see a proposal or prospectus document come in proposing secondary data analysis. And you can see the great alignment between the purpose statement, the research questions, hypotheses, even the problem statement has aligned well. We can read the theory section and everything aligns, but the student has not seen the data set yet. You are hoping that you find a data set that will prevent you from having to go back and start from the very beginning again. So again, the critical mistake is writing these key components before you have put your eyes and hands on a data set. Please do not make that mistake. I have seen too many cases where, unfortunately, we looked at the alignment, everything read well, and then the student said, now I've got to go find the data set. That is not the way that you do quantitative secondary data analysis. You must find that data set first, okay? So I really want to harp in on that point to make sure if anyone in this presentation is proposing secondary data analysis and you have not seen the data set yet, stop, hold everything, as we said in the previous slide, and get a hold of the data set and then see what feasible study you can design from the data set. It's actually what I call it is reverse engineering. We're starting backwards with the data and we're formulating then our study, which is a big difference in doing primary data collection, where we can ask any questions we want and then we use an instrument out there that measures those constructs and variables that we have put into our research questions and theory, etc. So primary, you know, it's a priori. You can write your questions, purpose statements, etc., but you cannot do that with secondary data analysis. You have to see the data first. That's a big concept, unfortunately, that's misunderstood, but it's a very devastating mistake when you have written an entire proposal and then say, now let me go find a data set. That is not the way to do quantitative secondary data analysis. If it's any takeaway point from this webinar, it's that you must get your hands on a potential data set or code book first before you start formulating and writing the key alignment components. I cannot make that any clearer or emphasize the importance of that very critical step. Now, we're now going to go over some resources that can be very helpful in the quantitative process. You can click on these links when you get the webinar, and this will be a basic quantitative overview. In that resource, that's where I will be talking about that relationship between theory and problem variable, basically predictive variables and dependent variable. Again, those theoretical constructs must be derived from the theory, and the dependent variable is that problem variable. There's a very detailed theory and quantitative research video tutorial. Again, these tutorials are no more than about 15 minutes, but very detailed and very application focused. Not really talking too much about the concepts, but then the application of what to do, just as we have done here in today's measurement. Critical to any quantitative effort is understanding the scales of measurement of that data that you find in that data set. How is it measured? And we talk about the 4 scales of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. That's important to understand because that determines the type of statistical analysis that you can and cannot do. But again, you will not be able to tell the reader what the scales of measurement of each of your variables are until you have the code book or the data file itself to see how is it measured. Was this a categorical variable? Was it an interval variable? Again, it is so many critical components that rely on you seeing the actual data set before you proceed with writing even as much as a prospectus, okay? Of course, the independent variables, here's some information on that, a little link that will take you some information, and understanding that those independent variables, again, are those variables that reflect your theory, okay? So for example, if your theory is transformational leadership, those independent variables should be those 5 variables identified by the developer of the transformational leadership theory. If your study is, say, grounded in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, safety, security, those are the independent variables and the variables that must be measured. And again, must be in the data set if you're saying your study is grounded in that theory. And of course, the dependent variable is the problem variable, the variable you're trying to understand or explain from your independent or your theoretical variables. So we have a SAGE encyclopedias. All of these we have housed in the Walden Library, so you'll be able to get easy access to these. Critical to quantitative is the hypotheses that are born from the research questions. We have a resource here. And again, if you go out to our CRQ webpage, Exploring Existing Data Sets, there's a lot of helpful information for data sets out there, how to find data sets, how to access databases, data sets, and will lead you directly to those data sets. So again, with these resources, you should be, in taking advantage of these, you should be well on your way to understanding the critical components of quantitative data analysis. But again, as you can see, you will need to have the data set before you are able to start discussing anything in your proposals, such as your theory, your scales of measurement, your variables, your hypotheses, etc. You must see that data set first. Now, well, suppose you want some additional assistance. You are always welcome to go to the Center for Research Quality and make a doctoral methodology advising appointment. Specifically, we're talking about the quantitative research here. You go out to our newly designed webpage, and if you are writing in the proposal stage and do not have an approved proposal, you would make an appointment with the Research Design Alignment button here. You'll click on that. That will identify our methodologist, our appointment schedule, and you click, fill out the information, the form, and you'll be scheduled for a 30 to 45-minute appointment with that methodologist to help you address those alignment issues, such as your problem statement, your purpose, your research questions, and analyses, etc. But again, what I do and why I found the need for this presentation, this webinar, was that in over the probably 200 to 300 appointments that I have done with individuals in my year or so at CRQ, and those that were doing secondary data analysis, that big mistake has been made in about 90% of the cases, where all of these alignment components were written and there had not been an eye set on a data set or a code book or any information to ensure that that data is available to the researcher. Now, once you get through the proposal and you've collected your data, you've got that quantitative data set, make an appointment using the quantitative SPSS and statistics tutoring. This is where We will work with you on setting up your SPSS data file, helping you run the analysis, helping you interpret the SPSS output, and even help you with preparing the appropriate APA statistical notation or the results section of your quantitative study. Now, I'll just go in and just put a burp in. We have the same thing going on the qualitative side if you're doing qualitative research. And again, we have the methodology office hours, and these are group sessions. And again, you can click on this link and go to the quantitative methodology office hours. Again, these won't be one-on-ones, but this will be whoever decides to come to that session that day at that time, and you can ask your questions and get some advice on your research design. And again, if it's quantitative secondary data analysis, this is one of the things that I will tell you. If it's quantitative, I'm going to say, stop, hold everything. Where's your data set? And if you don't have one, I'm going to say, stay on the call here, listen to everything that's said, and then make another appointment when you get your hands on the data set. Then I can help you with your research design alignment. I'm sure this makes perfectly good sense to everyone now, but you have no idea of how often this mistake is made. You can get to this appointment page here by clicking on the link down at the bottom that's presented there in blue. So we have a wealth of resources available for you that you are paying for, and we are sitting and willing and waiting to assist you with your research design alignment and with your statistical analysis if you choose to make that appointment. And I really don't see why anyone would not take advantage of this outstanding service. Now, in summary, we've briefly defined and described what secondary data analysis is. Again, that's data that's already available to you and is collected by someone else for other purposes, and you have found or hoping that that data is applicable for your research. But again, you must get your hands on that secondary data analysis set to avoid the biggest mistake, which is writing a great preponderance of your proposal and not knowing if you're going to have the data to align with it. It's like someone telling you the check is in the mail for $1,000 and you go out and put $1,000 on your credit card and you're waiting on that check to come and it never comes. Okay, so you don't want to do that. And that's like, you're going out shopping, writing your proposal, but that data, which would be the check, never comes in the mail. So please don't make that mistake. We talked about the 4-step process. Critical in that 4-step process is, again, getting your hands on that data set to start allowing you to write a feasible and doable proposal. We briefly talked about some IRB concerns. Again, there's public data and there's private data, and you really want to make sure you understand how to get access to that private data. Where is it stored? A lot of people have this stored through firewalls and all type of protected areas. You just want to make sure that you're able to get to it. And so you reach out to the IRB to address all those concerns and ask any additional questions. And we actually went through an application using the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, and we looked at that survey and looked at some of the items in that survey and saw that there was data collected on job satisfaction, and there was data collected on work-life balance. And we chose to ground our study in the work-life balance theory because that data was available to examine or understand our problem of job satisfaction. And we identified some very helpful resources. Again, most important, I would encourage you to take advantage of the doctoral research appointments, the one-on-one appointments that I discussed, and the quantitative methodology office hours, which are the group settings. Other than that, I hope that this has been very informative. And again, if there's anything to take away from this, if you are proposing quantitative secondary data analysis right now, when you get off of this webinar, ask yourself, do I have this data set? Have I seen the data set that I want to use? If not, go in search of that data set, and then you have all the information you need to write a feasible and doable proposal. Okay, so we'll go ahead now and address questions. You're very welcome. I'm looking in the chat area now. And Robert, thank you very much. I'm hoping it was very clear and that the main thing is that we don't want individuals making this big mistake. We just don't want that. You know, that creates a lot of problems for all of us involved.
Yeah, maybe we can address the questions people raise their hand.
Sure, Sonny, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you can say Leslie.
Okay, I'm trying.
All right, Dr. King, I've unmuted you. If you want to chime in.
Yeah, hey, Dr. Reggie, thank you for that. Liked all the stuff you put out before. I came in just a minute late, but I want to make sure that I'm kind of following you. So first, we start out with that research problem, kind of get a good idea of what the core of what you want to research is from sources. Go find that data set. Try to make sure that you lock into, make sure you know what kind of data you're getting a hold of, and make sure then, you know, I guess from the research problem, kind of know what your dependent variable is, or really is the problem you want to research and what you want to try to improve upon if you're talking about a professional doc. Your data set would be next. Make sure you see in there, you know, that there's plenty of data for your dependent variable, and then you'll get an idea of some independent variables also from that data set. So I just want to make sure you get that flow, because I think that's the way I've always understood it.
Yes, you're correct. Yes, you are.
Okay.
You're correct in your interpretation. Yes.
All right. Hey, thank you, Dr. Reggie. Appreciate that. Love your videos.
You're very welcome. Thank you for attending.
Yep.
And there are several questions in the chat. I know Dr. Liu's been answering a lot of them and addressing some. If you have any additional ones, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you as well.
Reggie, would you like to address a question that's been raised in the chat specific to, do you need to reach out to IRB if you're using a public data set?
Yeah, according to the IRB, the information that they relayed was that, and again, this was kind of new to me also, is that you can, you know, get access to a public data set without IRB approval. They even went as far as saying that you could even start analyzing the data or doing whatever you need to do with the data, again, as long as the chair agrees. And again, I don't see any reason why any chair would not agree to get a hold of the data set. And so to make sure that we are writing, you know, in alignment with the data set, and that we know that we won't run into a brick wall later on down the line. So again, yes, get a hold of the data set first, or the code book, or whatever you need. These code books in the data sets, usually they tell you what the variable is. They operationalize the variable, which you have to, you know, address it in your, according to your checklist. You know, how is that variable defined? That's in the code book. You know, how is it measured? Is it a nominal yes/no variable? Is it age? Is it measuring, you know, on an interval scale? Is it measuring it on an ordinal scale? All of this is very critical information that you're going to need to write a great preponderance of your methodology component. So without knowing that information, I just don't see how one could possibly write a proposal without having the critical information regarding the data.
Right, and thank you so much, Reggie, and thank you, Mary D. Yeah, one thing just to clarify, no one can begin collecting or analyzing data without IRB approval. You know, their proposal has to be approved by their committee. But Reggie, were you suggesting they could begin to make initial inquiries looking to see which data set might be appropriate prior to IRB approval?
We'll double check that, but when we held the session that led to us doing this webinar, Leilani from the IRB, you know, sent us the email and wanted us to make sure that we address the fact that, and I can send that information to you and we can get more specific information out. But it was just that with a public data set that the student could get the data. And again, this was a surprise to me. It could get the data and actually look at the data and even go as far as analyzing the data. And I can forward you that email if the chair approves. Now, we can check back with the IRB folks to make sure that that interpretation was correct. Now, it may be a little bit different with the private data set, but yes, that was pretty much verbatim from the email that was forwarded to us. So we'll.
And I would just encourage anyone to always reach out early and often to IRB, because the one thing that, that is just a Walden policy is any research that's conducted has to be IRB approved. So I would just, let us double check on that. But in the meantime, if you have questions, you can certainly reach out to IRB office hours early and often, just to make certain that you do have that approval to move forward. And as Gary Burkholder notes, there's a difference in analyzing data for preliminary purposes versus for your actual data for your research.
All right, Dr. Ego has her hand up, so I unmuted you. There we go. You should be able to talk. You'll have to unmute on your end, Ego.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
So can you hear me now?
Is
it
can.
better?
Welcome.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Thank you very much for this webinar because I've been faced with the issues of the extent to which students can go doing preliminary investigations or looking at the data before getting to the IRB. What stood out to me today, and I want some clarification, is at what point does student begin to use the data set that they have looked at? Because when they write the prospectus, they've given us an idea of where they're going to. Sometimes even they put the theory. But from what I'm hearing today, we don't even go all the way to the theory until we've looked at the data set. So I want to know exactly, if you can tell me where the cutoff line is and what they're looking at also in terms of preliminary search for the data set and trying to extract the variables and all the rest of it, but at what point can the student feel certain that they now know enough to tell us about the theory? You see what I'm saying? Because I'm writing about the theory, the proposal. What is your chapter?
I'm not sure there's a review, a very large component of your proposal. Now, let's just say you write about a particular theory, of course, which contains the variables, and then you go in search of a data set and you cannot find a data set that has all the data that you need. You have, in essence, written a great preponderance of a proposal that's not appropriate for your study.
Right, I understand that. What am I advising my students to do? The format they have had at Walden, at least to the best of my knowledge, is that they don't do anything with the data until the IRB has approved it. That means that they've already written the chapter 1, introduction, chapter 2, a literature review, that then, of course, includes their theory, and chapter 3, the methods, okay, at least for regular PhD students. So that's why I'm asking this question. When does a student tell us about the theory he or she is trying to use? Will it come before the premise or after the premise?
Well, again, to me, this is my interpretation of it, my take on it. I would advise a student, and I have done this when I've chaired, is that you have some preliminary ideas, of course, you go with preliminary ideas, but you don't want to go and write a great preponderance 10, 15 page on the theoretical framework.
Sure.
And you do not know that you are going to find a data set that has those variables or constructs in addition to your problem or dependent variable. So it's kind of like a, you know, when at what point. You're kind of doing a couple of things simultaneously. You know, you have an idea, but then you may say, okay, in a premise or something, I'm proposing this theory, but I'm saying at that point, you know, and this is my problem, I'm saying start looking for that data set or data sets as soon as possible, because you may say, I am not finding a data set that has transformational leadership in it and job commitment, my dependent variable. I'm just not finding one. Now, if you've written, you know, an extensive proposal, you know, with that alignment, then you have to rewrite your proposal. So, you know, it's not a particular date or time, but you kind of, you know, have to kind of play it by ear and not go too far. And it is going to be a point that I think everybody that is chairing a student would say, okay, at this point, let's see now, let's start looking at some data and see if we need to make some changes or some adjustments.
Dr. Taylor, this is great, but I would urge you and your team to please present this to students, because I have had the experience of students coming to me and saying, I've written all these proposal and stuff, but I can't find the data set.
That's the
I don't
point. Exactly. Exactly. And that's the biggest mistake. That's the slide reflecting the biggest mistake. Yes.
So if you guys can give this session to students, also it will make our job as chairs easier, because it will look as if we're contradicting what has been established in the system for them. You know, this is very useful to me, and I understand it perfectly. You know, but I need to be able to lead my student, at least to meet me halfway, rather than telling me, I've done all this in Dr. Ego. Do I have to change my variable? Where do I go and get the data? I can't find a data set that suits the research questions I've said. And I'm like, oh, Lord, you know, so please do.
From experience, again, I've seen too many cases where exactly what you have indicated, that a proposal has been written and then the student wants to make an appointment to say, okay, I just want to check my alignment. And I'm saying, okay, alignment looks great. Now let's look at this data set. And they're like, well, I haven't identified the data set yet. And I'm like, wow, okay, you've made that biggest mistake, because now we've got to find the data set. And, you know, we're going out there searching for a needle in a haystack, to hoping that everything that we need is contained in one data set. And in most cases,
that's all I have. Thank you so much.
But that's a very good point, and I think you caught the gist of the message here. You know that.
Thank you.
So, in terms of time, I would say the sooner the better that we can align the data set with what we're writing would be the ideal situation. Now, that may be different time frames for different individuals, but the sooner the better that you make that match. I guess is the point. Yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Okay.
Very excellent.
And Reggie, we have a couple of questions. One is specific to, can we incorporate this into the prospectus process? And another question is, how old is too old for secondary data? I have a student that wants to use a data set from 1992.
Okay, well, as far as how old is too old, I think that's a program specific and a research specific. For example, let's just say a student was doing research and wanted to do research on census data, you know, the U.S. census data, and it's 9 years after the last census. Well, that data would be 9 years old, but again, that's the latest and most recent data for that particular topic. So now, for example, another case is in the DBA program. You know, they had specific requirements that the data shouldn't really be, you know, older than 5 years. So I don't think, you know, and I'm, you know, would like to hear what anyone else says, that, you know, that would be a case specific response to that, is what's considered too old. And you know, that may be by discipline, by program, et cetera. But I think ideally is that, you know, if that same data set is from 1995, if it's collected annually, then why wouldn't you use the most, you know, recently available data? I don't know. But again, the approval of the studies are, at the program level, at chair level. So I couldn't say, 3 years is too old or 5. I don't know. I don't have a prescriptive response for that. Any other questions?
There were a few questions throughout asking for copies of the PowerPoint. Just so you know, we are recording this session, and I will be sending the recording along. Well, CRQ has the PowerPoint, so those will be available.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
And Dr. Hacker, you had asked if you can share the recording with students. I would say absolutely, because we do have several students on the line, and I want to congratulate the students on the line for all of their hard work. We know it's a long journey, but it's a journey that's worthwhile. So thanks for carving out to our students on the line an hour to join us today.
You're welcome, Gary. Thank you for attending. Yes. And again, any further questions, you can, send those to me at reginald.taylor3@mail.waldenu.edu. And if there's anything I can answer specifically with the IRB issues, but we're going to definitely follow up with this audience on that specific issue and that statement that I made regarding the IRB, just to make sure that I didn't misspeak. But we'll definitely get some definitive answers to that in terms of collecting data prior to the IRB approval and even analyzing the data. But yeah.
And Lita, maybe we could get that information and clarification to you before you send out the recording and slides, so it can be included in the note.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I will, Deborah, I will forward you that email, the response that we got from the IRB verbatim. I'll just forward that. And then we can double check with the IRB folks to make sure that our interpretation of that email was correct. If not, we'll correct our interpretation and get
awesome. Thanks.
You're very welcome. So if you think that this was very helpful, please give us some ideas of other types of quantitative topics that can be discussed. I have a list of some coming down the pipeline, but we hope to continue doing this format in helping assist everyone, faculty and students, in achieving that ultimate goal, and that's successful completion of a Walden doctoral degree. So thank you very much for your time, and stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And if you have a moment to complete the survey, there is a link on the screen. When I close out today's webinar, it'll also populate as a separate web page. We really appreciate you carving out the time. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Liu, and Dr. Inman for presenting such fabulous information. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.